Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 is where we're going to start tonight. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. While you're turning there, there's something I want to say about the book of Ruth that reminds me about the book of Revelation. And it's this, is when I was going through the book of Revelation 4 years ago, over 4 years ago now, I remember going through a lot of different books in the Bible. Daniel, Zechariah, a little bit of Ezekiel, Jeremiah even, going through 1 Thessalonians, looking at trying to get a grasp on some of the things that Revelation was talking about, and it was a help knowing other scriptures in the Bible. The book of Ruth is like that. There's a lot of understanding that can really be gained from the book of Ruth. If I can say it this way, it's almost like, I picture it almost like as a well. That someone can come to a well and they can look at the top of that well and get a good grasp that, okay, I guess there's water in there, and they can see the very top of it. But deep down, if they put that bucket down and they bring it up, that's where they get the real refreshment from it. And I think of that when I think of the book of Ruth, is that even just a child going through the book of Ruth can understand some basic things on the surface. But to really look at what it's talking about redemption, a lot of that has to really be understood from knowing other parts of the Bible. You know, you think about, can you imagine picking up a book, and I've actually done this before with some shows I've watched the ending just to kind of see how it goes, but can you imagine just starting in the middle of a book and trying to understand something? With the book of Ruth, it really is more chronological in the fact that you really have to understand the books before that. There's a lot of things that are mentioned to the Mosaic law, to the history of Israel, that plays a part in why they do what they do in the book of Ruth. You can understand some basic things, but without knowing the Mosaic law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and understand some of the period they're going through, it's really going to be difficult to understand the deeper things, the more important things in the book of Ruth. Also, throughout the rest of the Bible, there's a number of things that we understand about the culture of the Hebrews, that without understanding, reading through our Bibles a number of times to understand that culture, we'll miss out on the book of Ruth. There's also some other things that are mentioned that really you probably need a teacher to go through that. I got the same teachers. Meaning this is that I'm going to, when there's some names that we're getting into, the names of the towns and the names of the people, I looked to the Hebrew teachers and my concordance and things like that to tell me, what do the names of those towns mean? What do the names of those people mean? What are the significance of some of the phrases they say? So I'm going to take what I've learned and give that over to you also, and that hopefully to be a help to understanding the book of Ruth. So just to clarify again, I think there's some great things, and just in my Pew Bible here, it's really less than 6 pages. In most Bibles, it's probably not even 4 pages, this book of Ruth. But there's a lot that can be delved out of there from understanding other parts of the Bible, especially those first 5 books of the Bible. The theme of Ruth, as I mentioned before, it's the wondrous story of redemption. Interesting to me is that here's the whole thing of the book of Ruth. I'm going to put it like almost as a book format or a play format. You got the first 5 verses that are the introduction to the book of Ruth. Or if you want to be really highfalutin, I think you'd call it the prologue. And so you got those first 5 verses that give a little background to help understand what we're going through here. And then the rest of the book, all except the last few verses, is all about, it's a period that spans a number of months, but it's just 3 days in Ruth's life. That's it. The whole book is mostly, except for the beginning and ending there, the prologue, the epilogue there, you've got 3 days in Ruth's life. You have the day where Ruth decided she was going to leave Moab and go to Israel. Then you have the day that she met Boaz, and then you have the day of Ruth and Boaz's commitment to each other. Really, that started in the evening and then concluded in the morning of that next. So, and then after that, you have just a final section that really gives a conclusion that lets you know that there's more to this story than meets the eye. So again, it's 3 days in Ruth's life, and I mentioned again that the theme for this is redemption. And that really should be explained before we go any further into this passage here. So what I did is I looked up that word redemption or redeem in the Bible. And I'm just going to tell you, you can understand a lot about what that word means by just looking at the first 3 times that that's mentioned. Redemption really starts when somebody is in a pit or if they're in a perilous situation or something that they can't really overcome in of themselves. I think of the first time the word redeem or redemption is mentioned in the entire Bible. Jacob was actually the first person to use it. And he's giving really a testimony in front of his boys, and he says this, he goes, "The angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads." He gave really an understanding to what that means is that redemption means to redeem out of something. There has to be a pit. And just to give an example of our salvation, we are sinners in need of a Savior. We had to be redeemed from something. So redemption has to be in the fact that someone is in a pit or perilous circumstance. The second time the word is used is in the book of Exodus, where God says that I'm going to bring the Israelites out of the burden of the Egyptians. I'm going to rid them of their bondage, and I will redeem them. It says, I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm. It's just, again, the fact that taking someone out of, in Israel's case, out of slavery. So other than the fact, and I'm alliterating here, a pit or a peril, the second thing is that really is characteristic of redemption is a price. A price has to be paid for redemption. The third time the word redemption is used in the Bible, it's actually also, again, in the book of Exodus, where God is telling them that the firstborn of all the Israelites and of every beast, of every animal that is born throughout all Israel is his. And what they had to do is with the beast, they could sacrifice that unto God, but they could redeem certain ones. But with human beings, he said, no, you're not sacrificing human beings. What you're going to do is you redeem the firstborn. And they'd give a price. In order, if the firstborn of your family was born, that firstborn would be considered God's. But what they do is they would pay a certain amount of money. They give it over to the tabernacle, give it to the priests there, and it would be they'd redeem them as what they'd buy them back from God in a sense. So again, with redemption, there's a couple things that we want to remember. Someone is in a perilous situation. They're down in a pit. They can't get out themselves. Number 2, a price has to be paid to get them out. And we're going to see those both in the book of Ruth. And there's something that really is a tendency when it comes to redemption. And that's this, is that in the Mosaic law, somebody they could sell themselves to another person. Basically say until the year of Jubilee, when they'd be set free, or after working for 7 years, they'd have a time where they'd work for that person, and they would sell themselves to another person. Basically say, look, I'm in debt. I can't get out of this. I will work for you. I will be your servant. I will be your slave. And then, again, after that period of time, they'd be set free. But they could, in that period of time, they could redeem themselves. Or they could sell a piece of land. It's a land that is theirs. It would go back to them in the year of Jubilee. But for right now, they'd sell that land in order to get money for something. And once they sold that land, they had the option to buy that land back. But there's a problem with that. God gave them that option, but there's a problem. It was the people that tended to sell their land and even sell themselves tend to be poor people. And if someone's poor already and is selling their land to get money, they're not going to take of that money and pay maybe even extra to get that land back again. So something that's a tendency with redemption is that the person themselves tended not to be able to get out of that. They couldn't redeem themselves. So again, with redemption, someone is in a perilous circumstance. They're down in a pit. A price has to be paid. And the tendency in the Bible is that they were not able to redeem themselves. And that's different than the word redemption is used today. When you use the redemption in modern literature and even in movies today, they'd say that person has redeemed themselves. Well, you're not going to find that in Scripture. You find that God has to redeem them, that they're in too much for themselves. And the scriptural application for us is back in Romans 5:6. When we were yet without strength, Christ died for the ungodly. There's nothing we could do to save ourselves. So I just want to understand those principles of redemption before we get into this. And a number of things, when I studied the book of Ruth, something that was interesting to me, I always considered it Ruth's redemption, and it is. But it's just as equally her mother-in-law's redemption, Naomi. We're going to look at a Jewish person's redemption, that is Naomi. We're going to look at a Gentile's redemption, that is Ruth. Both were equally redeemed. One would be the bride of Boaz there. The other one would still be redeemed and brought in to the family there. But both are redeemed. So in just a moment, again, we're going to start Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And we're going to start, the theme of really tonight is really a tragedy. It's setting the stage for redemption. And the fact that, remember about redemption, someone's going to be in a pit. They're going to be in a perilous situation. And we're going to learn about what that situation is. And then, Lord willing, we'll plan to continue on through the book of Ruth the following Sunday evening. So let's read verses 1 through 5. And it says this. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So here we're going to see here what the tragedy that happened, what situation Naomi was in, and furthermore her daughters-in-law, what they were in. They went from Israel, a man by the name of Elimelech, his wife, and also their 2 sons, left the land of Israel to go into Moab. They stayed there. Then, first of all, the father dies. The sons marry Moabite women, and then the sons die also. And then we leave Naomi in that last verse really with emptiness. I mean, honestly, I don't know what Naomi would be feeling like. How do I, unless maybe you've gone through that very thing. You've lost a spouse and the only kids that you've had. I mean, I don't know that I certainly can't say I've experienced the pain that Naomi felt, but we can understand one thing. She was in great pain. And also, she was empty. She was hurting physically. She also, I believe here, was also hurting spiritually, and that it was not just her husband's bad choice here, but also Naomi has a spiritual choice that she needs to make also. Naomi is in a perilous situation. She's down in a pit, and she needs to be redeemed. Not only is she going to have the opportunity to redeem, but also her daughter-in-law, Ruth, is going to have that opportunity also. But I wanted to give an overview of those first 5 verses that we see this tragedy that's happening. Now let's give a little more detail on that. Look, if you would, back at verse 1. It says, Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. First thing I want to mention is that when I talk about a tragedy happened here, the biggest tragedy, spiritually speaking, that happened in this chapter was not a famine that happened in the land. It was not the husband passing away. It was not the 2 sons passing away. Not because those aren't tragedies, those certainly are. That's certainly heartbreak, no question about that. But spiritually speaking, in God's eyes, what caused God heartbreak more than anything was in that very first verse. It was not about the famine. It was not the fact that there was hardship. I assure you that God was afflicted in everything they were afflicted in. This was his people. He does not enjoy any hardships that his people go through. But this was the real tragedy is the fact that he went to Moab. He left the land of his inheritance to go to Moab. And we're going to look at that more in just a moment. But one of the things that give you the characteristic of the day and age he's living in and get you some idea of some of the people's choices is in the very first part it says, in the days when the judges ruled. Now, what do you all know about that? When it says in the days when the judges ruled. In fact, finish this statement. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes, right? That's characteristic of in the days of the judges. So this is something that, now, Elimelech and his family, he doesn't have to do this, but this is characteristic of him. When a famine came in the land, it looked right to him. Famine here, we could probably have better circumstances in another land. At least I hear that they have. He heard probably they could do better in Moab, and maybe they did have more prosperity in Moab. I don't know. But he left the land of his inheritance to go to Moab. Every man did that which is right in his own eyes. And when you see that phrase, Bethlehem, Judah, that's not just a really long name. The reason they have that is because there is actually 2 Bethlehems in Israel. No one knows about the second Bethlehem because that was further north there. But the Bethlehem this is referring to that became famous is Bethlehem in the land of Judah. That's where Jesus would end up being born. And we look here is that they left the land of Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem means house of bread. Now, it doesn't mean that nothing hard would happen, but this was the place where it's just interesting to me that they left a town called the house of bread to go to another land. God had promised that he'd provide. God never said in his word, no famine will ever come. You'll never have times of hardship. That's not promised in God's word. As a people, God did promise there is a truth to a health and wealth that he promised his people in general, that if they as a group would follow them, he would give them material prosperity. That's a specific promise made to Israel as a group. But quite honestly, I'm just even going to give Elimelech and his family the benefit of the doubt. If the Israelites as a whole were going against God, they would be judged by famine, or maybe this was just a dry time in their life. But let's just say they were judged as a whole. And maybe even up to that point, Elimelech, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, the father here, had been a pretty regular follower of God. And now he comes to a time of famine, and he's going to decide where he's going to go. And in order to, again, when he left Israel in order to go to Moab. But the very first choice was in leaving Israel. Now, the question I have with this is, why would somebody leave the land of their inheritance? And the example, or the truth of this is found right in the book of Ruth. There was a famine there. He was looking for food, and there's nothing wrong with looking for food. The issue is God said, I am giving you this land. God even told them they were to dwell in it and possess it. Deuteronomy 11:31. You're to dwell in it and possess it. This was a land that was given to them by God. And truth of the matter is, just the bottom line is this. There's no way it's showing real faith in God to leave something that God has clearly provided you and to go somewhere else. God has appointed you somewhere. God has again, it doesn't have to be supernatural, but something that God has provided, a way that God has led you in, and now comes to a time of whatever that famine is in our life. And each and every one of us, we naturally want to bail. Everybody does. But then we decide, am I going to stay where God has put me? It's not that we enjoy the situation. It's not that we enjoy the circumstance. But if God has led me to this point, am I going to die here, or is God going to lead me through? We have a choice in what we're going to believe. Elimelech, I'm sure, made the choice that most people probably would make, just doing what is right in their own eyes. It would make sense to him, but it wasn't showing real faith in God. And here's what I find interesting also. When we make choices based on material things first, and here's what I'm pretty sure, it doesn't say, here's what I'm pretty sure Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, and I don't know how much part Naomi had in this, but here's what I think they probably would have said. Probably the same thing that is the number one reason today. I'm doing this for my family. Oh, I just love my family. I want to provide for my family. I'm doing this. And we have some really supposedly good reasons, but God is not first. Family, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting that family can actually be an idol. And the bottom line is, it wasn't showing real faith in God. And when he was doing this, in order to when he's leaving the land of Israel, he's not only leaving the land of his inheritance, but he's also leaving the place of worship. Now, back at that time, remember the tabernacle wasn't in Jerusalem. There's a city that starts with an SH. Does anybody know what that city is? What? Shiloh, that's right. You should remember that because it's a sh sound, right? Okay, all right. Shiloh, that's right. So the tabernacle there was in Shiloh, and they were required to go to that tabernacle. You couldn't, there were certain things that you didn't have to go to the tabernacle for, but for specific worship and sacrifices, they were required. They couldn't just sacrifice them in their own land. They had to go to Shiloh. So now that they're leaving and going to Moab, you can forget that he's going to be worshiping God like God told him to. It's a downward spiral that's going to happen, that if I do this, well, it's going to take me away from worship. And again, I see that today as a pastor. Maybe you can say, well, any pastor preached this, but you see it so often as far as I'm going to do something for material gain. It's not good for my relationship with God, but God understands. I'll give more to the church that way. It'll keep me out of church more, but whatever excuses we have for him here, for Elimelech and his family, they're going to leave Israel. And I'm not going to go on a 30 points more on this. I'm just going to say this is there's no way that was going to help his relationship with God. There is no way that he was showing real faith in God by doing that. So he left Israel. And that's what I would call the first step that we see of a downward progression. His first step is he saw, okay, there's a famine here, and he had just the seed of doubt in his heart. Well, where do I go? I'm going to leave Israel. And now he decides to go to Moab. Moab was a place that you wouldn't naturally want to go to. The Israelites were actually prohibited from mingling with the Moabites. In fact, here's what God said in Deuteronomy 23:6. Thou shalt not seek their peace nor their prosperity all thy days forever. Now, that's pretty strong. In fact, out of all the promises in the Bible of you better stay away from, this is one of the strongest ones I could find. Don't seek their peace. Don't seek their prosperity forever. Forever. And so generation after generation, don't do that. So here it's interesting to me that once he decided to leave Israel, he's going to go down, he's going to end up going to Moab. And I don't think personally he liked being in Moab. I think if you would have asked him, he would have said, oh, I would rather be in Israel. I'd rather not be here. But I'm just gonna sojourn, which means I'm just going to stay for a little while, temporarily. I'm just traveling through just to get some things here, and then I'll head back. I think that's probably what he would have told you. I do know that the word that's used in there is that they went to sojourn. Look at verse 2, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So now we see a downward progression. We see them sojourning. They're just going to travel there for a little bit. I look at the fact that he decides to go to Moab, and then it has a little phrase at the very end that we can miss. He and his wife and his 2 sons. Elimelech is the head of his home, no question about that. And God really puts again, I'm not saying Naomi's faultless in this. It doesn't say right here at least what choice she had in the matter. All I'm saying is where God puts this. I see the issue with Elimelech making a choice. And when he goes down to Moab, so does his wife, so does his 2 sons. And it's going to affect them. One of the tragic things that you find is in Genesis chapter 19, we find Lot's daughters, when they said, well, when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, you find Lot's daughters saying, well, we're not going to be able to have any children. I guess we're just going to have to lie with our own father. And the saddest thing about that to me is not the incest there, not even the fact that they didn't even think it was wrong, is that the biggest blame for that, although his daughters were at fault, was on Lot. Lot chose to raise his daughters in Sodom, and it's no question that his daughters are going to be raised up with the same morals as the Sodomites. And here, as he's going to bring his family into Moab, it's going to affect them. I tell you, it affects me. It affects me. You and I, we have a sin nature inside of us, and we have people out there that are trying to tempt us. We are not immune to temptation, not in the least. Not any pastor, not any evangelist, not anybody out in the congregation. Nobody is immune to that, not in the least. So they're a downward progression. When he left Israel, he went to Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons, and then also some interesting names. Look, if you would, at verse 2. It says, and the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. Elimelech means, and you can know this, and there's not going to be a test afterwards, I don't think. But anyway, usually anytime you see the word El or Eli, that refers to the word God. Melech in the Bible refers to the word king. And so Elimelech would refer to, my God is my king. Yet here we have Elimelech, in spite of what his name said, here now he's going to leave the land of Israel, leave the land of his inheritance, not be able to worship in that tabernacle of Shiloh, and going to Moab, out not having faith in God. The other names there is Naomi. Naomi means pleasant, or my pleasantness. And Naomi, at this beginning of this, I believe she had a pleasant disposition. She was a nice person to be around. You would want Naomi on your team. If you were doing something, oh, I want Naomi to help out with this or that. Everybody would want Naomi. She was just a genuine, nice person, I believe. According to her testimony that I know later on. Well, we find out that at the end of this chapter, although she starts off pleasant, she comes back empty. She comes back bitter. In fact, at the end of this chapter, she would tell other people, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Naomi starts off pleasant, but boy, does it change. The 2 sons are names that I am glad my mother did not name me. I'm glad you did not name your kids, Mahlon and Chilion. The words Mahlon means sick. Words Chilion means pining or wasting away. What loser names. I mean, can you imagine having these names there? But the bottom line is, when I think of these names here, I just bring it up the son's name because of this. In Israel, they tended to name people not just because they didn't look in a baby book, like a lot of you all did probably, and they didn't think, okay, what would be a really cool name to do? Or, I really like this name. That's not how they named a lot of people back then. They would name people based on circumstances. Remember Esau, meaning red? He was covered, he looked like a red, hairy garment when he came out. They would name people based on either a circumstance at their birth or something about the person. Now, I don't know exactly why they named them this way, but I'm just going to go out on a limb because I think this may have had an idea for why they left. Let's just speculate. This is not scripture. But let's just speculate that Mahlon and Chilion were just like their names actually were. Okay, we're just speculating here. Maybe Mahlon was really a sickly kid. Maybe he needed extra attention, and maybe he needed extra food. Maybe Chilion, who looked like he was just wasting away, was a thin guy. He maybe he just constantly needed more attention. Maybe these 2 kids would really pull at the heartstrings of Naomi, or really pull on, and maybe because of that it would pull on Elimelech. And the fact they thought, well, you know what? I really feel a stress and a pressure to provide and get more food for my family. And by the way, I do believe that they probably did love their kids. Maybe not a biblical type of love, meaning doing the spiritual thing, but I think they had a love for their kids. They wanted to provide for their family. But their son's health and maybe disposition made it more of a risk, maybe, for them to be during that time of famine. So I just want to give them every benefit of the doubt, try to have them a fair situation, but they would have a choice. Are they going to cling to God? Are they going to trust God? Are they going to look to Him? Or are they going to go their own way? And they went to Moab. Notice not only did they sojourn there, but verse 2 at the end says, and continued there. I guess we see a downward progress, because even if we decide, I'm only going to just start out, the truth of the matter is, we can decide that all we want, but the bottom line is, once we get comfortable somewhere, we're not going to want to leave. You see this over and over. I mentioned Lot before. Once he went closer and closer to Sodom, eventually went in there, and then he stayed there. In spite of the fact that I can just picture Lot speaking this to Abraham when Abraham rescued him from being taken captive because he happened to be in Sodom at that time. I can just picture Lot saying, oh, Abraham, thank you for rescuing me. I will never go back in that city again. I can just picture him saying that. I bet they just decided they were going to just start out, but they continued there. And maybe they deceived themselves, because the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Maybe they just deceived their own selves and thought, well, you know what, we'll just continue here for a little bit longer. And a day turned into a week, to a month, to months, to years, to over 10 years that they were down in Moab. Look, if you would, in verse 3. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. It touches me. She was left. And this is not so much about Naomi, because really up until this point, I am looking at Elimelech and the bad choice that he made. And it's unfortunate. Most of the commentaries I read put most of the blame on Naomi, and they're dead wrong on that. Elimelech's the head of the home. He made the choice by going down there. At least up until this point, I feel sorry for Naomi being in this place here. She lost her husband, and she was left and her 2 sons. I want to say this when we, just some practical points on this. We ought to think, where am I going to leave? What am I going to leave my family, my loved ones? What am I, if something happened to me, what kind of position would they be put in? That's a great application, I think, to this verse. I don't know that Elimelech's death was a judgment of God. I'm not going to say that it is. Here's what I do know for certain, that life is uncertain. That even if I can say, well, it wasn't a judgment of God, we know that we don't know how long we're going to live. And when he died, what's going to happen now to Naomi? She's now left in Moab. The kids are now left in Moab. Look, if you would, at verse 4. And they took them wives of the woman of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. Now here we see another progression. It's no surprise, it should not be at least, that if they're going to go to Moab, where are these young men going to find wives? Well, of course, in Moab. Why? Because they have pretty ladies in Moab just like they do anywhere else. They're going to learn to speak the language of Moab. They're going to learn a lot of the culture of Moab. Unfortunately, probably not a lot of good things. And when it came time for them to be married, and there was a real pressure, by the way, for them to be married here. They're now going to be providing for their mother. They don't have their father to help with things. They want to grow up and man up and start taking care of the house. And now they're thinking, well, let's build a family now. And again, I think that there was some probably noble motives in doing this. But they took women of Moab, which was prohibited. God said, don't even seek their peace or prosperity forever. They were prohibited from marrying these women, because God said they're gonna take your hearts away. And we look here that the prohibition, both Old Testament and New Testament, of marrying unbelievers, and that's what they did. This was started with Elimelech's choice by not clinging to God, and God is a jealous God. It's not that we can say, well, I'm just going to have the name my God is king, and I'm just going to be called an Israelite. We have a choice of whether God is really going to cling to him and during that time of hardship, or whether we're going to run, really, whether we're just going to do what seems like all other Christians are doing. I want to do the same things. You and I, we want to do what is right in our own eyes. We don't have to. We can cling to God. Now, Naomi has a choice right here. She has a choice on whether she's going to stay in the land of Moab. I'm doing speculating here. I'm just going to be honest about that, some of the speculation I'm doing. But I speculate after her husband died, I can say this, is that Naomi was no longer under the authority of her husband, and maybe she even pressured her husband to go to Moab. That's a complete speculation. Maybe she had nothing with that. But after her husband died, she now has a choice. Am I going to stay in Moab? Or am I going to go back to the land of my people? Am I going to influence my kids to go back to the land of my people? Scripture doesn't say exactly all the, her thoughts and her beliefs during this, but I'm just going to bring it up because we all have power over our own choices. We can blame Elimelech all we want. We all have our own choices also. And I'm going to speak about the sons specifically. The sons can blame their dad for taking them in a heathen land, but they cannot blame their father, they cannot blame their mother for marrying these heathen women. Heathen does not mean they were like in some jungle far away doing human sacrifices. That's not referring to. Heathen just means they were not Israelite. They were not worshipers of the true God. And they married these women. Again, we all have our own choice to make. In spite of all these things that are going to happen, God is going to work a wonderful story of redemption through that lady named Ruth. And Ruth, by the way, was an unbeliever. I know the book is written, in fact, the title is about her. It could be called the Book of Redemption. But this is not so much about, we look at Ruth as she was this virtuous lady, but she didn't start out there. In fact, the people of Moab worshiped the god of Chemosh. Chemosh, you could sacrifice it. You could even do child sacrifice to Chemosh. Chemosh was not somebody, as even secular history would look at the different gods of the Canaanite region around there in Israel. There's some awful wicked stuff. How much was Ruth involved in? I do not know, but I know that she started out just like any other person starts out, as an unbeliever. But God is going to take and do a wonderful work in this woman's heart. Ruth, it starts off with some bad choices, starting with Elimelech. But you're going to see God really make beauty out of ashes. God's going to do a wonderful thing here. So Naomi's left. Look, if you would, at verse 5. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Again, I feel for Naomi. She lost her husband, she lost her 2 sons. And I will say this, I don't know how much of a part Naomi played when they originally went to Moab. But if she did play a part, I tell you what, she's certainly learning her lesson. I feel for her. I would say this, is that if you have a Naomi in your life that maybe had made some wrong choices, I'd be careful before you spout it out on them, because if someone's reaping what they sow, that's a good lesson in of itself. I'd be careful about piling on top of them. And when I look at Naomi, boy, I really feel for her. She's dealing with a lot of heartbreak. She's widowed and bereaved of her 2 sons. And she's also in Moab. She's away from God's purpose. So here she is, I talked about before, being in a pit or a perilous situation. She's a widow, she's bereaved of her 2 sons, and she's also in Moab, out of the plan that God would have for her life, out of God's perfect plan, out of God's purpose for her. But God's going to redeem her from that, not by raising her sons from the dead. No, God is going to work something beautiful out of this. Did it cause a lot of heartache? Oh, yes, it did. But this is going to set the stage for redemption Naomi's redemption. I'm going to read a verse for you before we're finished here this evening. I was looking for something that kind of summed up with how God set the stage of redemption here. And I'll read that verse in just a moment, but I think of when I think of Naomi, I think of, in Naomi and Ruth, I think Naomi is a Jewish person, Ruth is a Gentile, and I think of what God did with the Jewish people. God watched the Jewish people wander away from him. He judged them over and over, and finally they went into captivity. They were scattered throughout all the known world there. In fact, even some of his faithful people were out in Babylon. Daniel was there. He was in Babylon to no fault of his own. He was taken captive, and Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But, I think of Naomi similar to almost that. Just like the Israelites were scattered, gone away, even if they wanted to get back, now they're just waiting to see what God is going to do. I think of that with Naomi. Naomi, just like the people had been scattered into Babylon and thinking, well, God is done with us, God is not done with Naomi. Here's what the Bible says in Micah 4:10. God says this to Israel, "Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. For now shalt thou go forth out of the city, and shalt dwell in the field, and thou shalt go even to Babylon. There thou shalt be delivered. There the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies." That's what I think of when I think of Naomi, that Naomi's in an awful position. She's destitute. She could, again, unless something changes of this situation, she's going to die just flat out of poverty and hunger. She's emotionally distraught. Imagine losing your husband, losing your 2 children. And she's also not at the place where she needs to be. She's out of the land of Israel. But God is going to redeem her anyway, even out of the worst situation. So my encouragement, again, we had to, before we get to God's plan of redemption, we got to look at the first part, the tragedy that happened, the peril, the situation she's in. Later on, we're going to look at the price that was paid to get not only her out of that, but also her daughter-in-law, Ruth. But I want you to know there's no place, as long as you are still breathing here today, no situation you could be in, even if it's of your own choices, that God cannot redeem you out of it. It doesn't mean that we're going to get back all that we physically lost. No, but God can make something beautiful in his own time.